Somewhere in the rolling tobacco fields of central Virginia, 6 women gave birth within the same 14-month period. All 6 delivered healthy boys with identical physical characteristics, unusual height for infants, distinctive amber-colored eyes, and a birth arc shaped like a crescent moon on their left shoulders. The births were recorded in a private family ledger, not in any county register. The attending physician, Dr. Silas Hartwick, noted in his personal journal that he had never seen such consistent genetic features across half-siblings in his 30 years of practice. He also noted something else. All 6 mothers were daughters of the same woman, a plantation widow named Helena Ravenswood, and according to whispered accounts from the household staff, all 6 children shared the same father, a man who was listed in the estate's property inventory as item number 47. The family destroyed most records related to these births before the Civil War reached Virginia, but fragments survived in courthouse basements and private collections, raising questions that historians have avoided answering for over a century and a half. Before we continue with the story of the Ravenswood estate and what truly happened behind its columned facade, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's uncover what Helena Ravenswood set in motion in 1847. That private ledger discovered in 1923 during the demolition of the estate's west wing would reveal a calculated experiment in human breeding that defied every social convention of antebellum Virginia. The Ravenswood plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of prime Virginia soil, 20 miles south of Richmond. Established in 1789 by Helena's husband's grandfather, the main house stood 3 stories tall, built from red brick with white columns that could be seen from the main road, a deliberate display of wealth and permanence. Oak trees, older than the nation itself, lined the approach, their branches forming a canopy that kept the drive in perpetual shade even at midday. By 1847, the plantation operated with 73 enslaved people, producing tobacco and corn that supplied markets as far north as Baltimore. The estate's reputation had once been impeccable. The Ravenswoods were known for attending church every Sunday, hosting cotillions that attracted families from 3 counties, and maintaining what they called proper order in all their affairs. Helena Ravenswood had been born Helena Pritchard in 1801, the daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant. She married Edmund Ravenswood in 1820, bringing a substantial dowry that modernized the plantation's operations. Edmund had been a methodical man, keeping detailed records of every bushel harvested, every tool purchased, every birth and death among the people he claimed as property. He maintained those records in leather-bound ledgers that he stored in a locked cabinet in his study. The couple had 6 daughters in rapid succession: Virginia, born 1821, Caroline, 1823, Elizabeth, 1824, Margaret, 1826, Catherine, 1828, and Sarah, 1830. Edmund had wanted sons desperately, sons to inherit the plantation to carry forward the family name to ensure the Ravenswood legacy. After Sarah's birth, Helena suffered complications that made further pregnancies impossible. Edmund never quite forgave her for this, though he never spoke of it directly. Instead, his disappointment manifested in cool politeness and increasingly long trips to Richmond on business that everyone knew included other company. Edmund died in December 1846, thrown from his horse during a fox hunt. The horse had stumbled in a groundhog hole, and Edmund struck his head on a stone marker that delineated the property line. He was 49 years old. He left behind a will that granted Helena control of the entire estate until such time as one of his daughters married a man deemed suitable to assume management, a man of proper breeding, education, and family connections. Helena was 45 when she became a widow. Her daughters ranged in age from 16 to 25. Virginia and Caroline had received marriage proposals from respectable families, but Edmund had rejected them, finding fault with each suitor's lineage or financial prospects. The younger daughters remained unmarried, waiting for their father's approval that would never come. The problem Helena faced was both immediate and existential. Under Virginia law, a woman could control property only as long as she remained unmarried, or until a male heir came of age. Her daughters' marriages would transfer control to their husbands. The estate required someone capable of the intensive labor of managing tobacco cultivation, someone who understood the land, someone strong enough to maintain authority. But more than that, Helena had become obsessed with an idea that had taken root during Edmund's final years. An idea about bloodlines, about breeding, about creating the perfect heir. She had spent countless hours in Edmund's study after his death, reading his agricultural journals, his breeding records for the plantation's horses and cattle. Edmund had been meticulous about improving livestock through selective pairing, noting which combinations produced the strongest animals, the best temperaments, the most valuable offspring. The record showed calculated decisions spanning decades. Each generation carefully planned to enhance desired traits among the enslaved population. There was a man named Isaac Drummond. He was 28 years old in 1847, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a build that came from years of blacksmithing work. His parents had been sold south before he was old enough to remember them clearly, and he had been raised by an elderly woman named Ruth, who had died the previous winter. Isaac could read, taught in secret by Ruth, who had learned from a Quaker family that previously owned her. And he possessed what the plantation's overseer described in reports as unusual intelligence and self-control. Daisy worked primarily in the forge, creating and repairing tools, shoeing horses, making the iron fittings needed for plantation operations. Edmund had valued his work enough to allow him a small cabin of his own rather than quarters in the common buildings, a privilege that set him apart. He had amber-cold eyes, unusual enough that people remarked on them, and a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on his left shoulder. Helena had noticed Isaac years before Edmund's death, though not for any romantic inclination. She had noticed him the way Edmund noticed a promising colt or a bull with good conformation. She had watched how other enslaved people deferred to him despite having no official authority, how he moved with controlled strength, how he solved problems with mechanical equipment that baffled others. She had noted his height, his health, his evident intelligence. 3 months after Edmund's burial, Helena began making unusual requests of her household staff. She wanted detailed information about Isaac's daily routines, his health, his interactions with others. She requested that Dr. Hartwick examine him under the pretense of ensuring the plantation's most valuable craftsmen remained in good condition. Dr. Hartwick's report noted excellent health, superior physical development, and no signs of disease or defect. Helena's daughters had been raised to be decorative, taught piano, French, needlework, and just enough literature to make conversation. They had been prepared for marriages that would serve the family's social ambitions. But Edmund's death had changed their circumstances dramatically. Without a father to arrange advantageous marriages, without brothers to inherit and protect them, they faced an uncertain future. Several of the men who had previously sought their hands suddenly found reasons to redirect their attentions elsewhere. The whispers had already begun. The Ravenswood girls left in their mother's sole care, their father's estate valuable, but their own prospects diminishing with each passing month. Helena gathered her daughters in the main parlor on a March evening in 1847. The room was lit by oil lamps that cast shadows on the wallpaper imported from France, on the portrait of Edmund that hung above the fireplace, on the faces of 6 young women who had no idea what their mother was about to propose. What Helena told them that evening would set in motion events that violated every social, moral, and legal boundary of their time and place. Helena spoke for nearly 2 hours that March evening, and by all accounts, not one of her daughters interrupted her. She began with practicalities, the estate's financial position, the legal vulnerabilities they faced as women without male protection, the declining marriage prospects they all understood but rarely acknowledged aloud. She discussed bloodlines with the clinical detachment Edmund had used when discussing livestock, explaining genetic inheritance with surprising sophistication for someone who had never received formal scientific education. Then she presented her solution. She wanted grandsons, multiple grandsons, born close enough in time to be raised together, educated together, prepared together to inherit and manage the plantation as a collective. But these grandsons needed to be superior in every way, physically strong, mentally capable, healthy, resilient. To achieve this, Helena had concluded that they needed a father who embodied those exact traits, and she had selected Isaac Drummond. The silence that followed her announcement was broken by Caroline, the second daughter, who asked if their mother had lost her mind. Helena responded by opening one of Edmund's breeding ledgers and walking them through 20 years of horse breeding records, showing how deliberate selection had improved the plantation stock from mediocre to exceptional. She used the language of agriculture, of rational improvement, of practical necessity. Virginia, the eldest, at 25, pointed out what should have been obvious, that what Helena proposed was illegal, immoral, and would destroy them, socially if it became known. Helena agreed that it must remain absolutely secret. She had already considered this. The pregnancies could be attributed to brief discreet marriages to men who died shortly after. Yellow fever, cholera accidents were common enough, or they could simply withdraw from society during the pregnancies, a practice not uncommon for women of their class. The births would be recorded privately, and the children could be raised as orphaned relatives, wards of the estate. Elizabeth, the third daughter, asked the question that the others were thinking but couldn't voice. How did Helena intend to force Isaac's cooperation in this scheme? Helena's response revealed the depths of her calculation. She didn't intend to force anything. She intended to offer Isaac something that held more value than anything else could: legal manumission for himself and the future legal freedom for his children, documented and guaranteed. She would draw up papers witnessed and notarized, promising his freedom and attractive land after the last child was born. She would ensure his children were educated, that they grew up not as enslaved people, but as heirs to the plantation. She would offer him what the system made almost impossible: a future for his bloodline. The cynicism of this offer was staggering. Helena understood that enslaved people were not actually property despite the legal fiction, that they had hopes and desires and agency. She was offering to weaponize Isaac's natural human desire for family and freedom against him, to make him complicit in a scheme that would forever entangle his children with the daughters of his enslaver. Margaret, the fourth daughter, began to cry. Catherine, the fifth, stared at the floor. Sarah, the youngest at 16, asked if they had any choice in the matter. Helena's answer was honest in its brutality. They could refuse. They could watch the plantation decline, their marriage prospects diminish further, their financial security evaporate. They could wait for the estate to be claimed by distant male cousins or sold to pay debts. They could accept positions as governesses or depend on the charity of relatives who would never let them forget their reduced circumstances. Or they could participate in securing their future through the only means available to them. She gave them 3 days to decide. During those 3 days, the household staff noticed changes in the usual rhythms of the estate. The daughters took long walks alone in the gardens. Helena spent hours in Edmund's study. Dr. Hartwick made an unusual house call, staying for dinner and speaking with Helena in private for over an hour. The overseer was given unexpected leave to visit family in North Carolina, removing him from the property for a month. On the third day, all 6 daughters agreed. Their recorded reasons varied. Some framed it as duty to the family, others as practical necessity, one simply as having no acceptable alternative, but they all agreed. Helena's next step was approaching Isaac himself. She summoned him to the main house on a Saturday evening, unusual because enslaved people were never invited into the family's private quarters except for specific service tasks. She met with him in Edmund's study, the room where her late husband had planned crops and calculated profits. The conversation that occurred between Helena Ravenswood and Isaac Drummond in that study was never recorded in any document that survived, but its outcome was clear. Within a week, construction began on a small cottage in a secluded area of the estate, screened by trees from both the main house and the quarters. The cottage had its own well, its own garden plot, and a level of comfort that would have been extraordinary for an enslaved person. Virginia was the first to move into the cottage in April 1847. She remained there for 3 months before returning to the main house. The pattern repeated with mathematical precision. Each daughter spent approximately 3 months in the cottage, then returned to the main house. The intervals between their residencies varied slightly, but the sequence followed the birth order of the sisters: Virginia, Caroline, Elizabeth, Margaret, Catherine, and finally Sarah. Household staff who worked in the main house were reassigned or given additional tasks that kept them away from the cottage area. Supplies were delivered by a trusted enslaved woman named Dia, who had been Helena's personal maid for 20 years. Delia was promised her freedom as well. Upon completion of what Helena called the project, Dr. Hartwick began making regular visits to the estate, arriving every few weeks to check on the family's health. His visits increased in frequency as the first pregnancies progressed. What happened in that cottage over the following 18 months would remain one of the most carefully guarded secrets in Virginia's history. A secret maintained through fear, complicity, and the understanding that exposure would destroy everyone involved. Virginia delivered her son in January 1848, 11 months after moving into the cottage. Dr. Hartwick attended the birth, recording it in his private journal, but nowhere else. The boy was healthy, weighing nearly 9 pounds, with the distinctive amber eyes and crescent-shaped birthmark that would characterize all his half-brothers. Virginia named him Edmund after her father, perhaps seeking to legitimize the child through nomenclature, if not through any other means. Caroline gave birth in May 1848, Elizabeth in August, Margaret in December, Catherine in March 1849, Sarah, the youngest daughter, delivered her son in June 1849, just after her 19th birthday. 6 sons born to 6 sisters across 18 months. All bore the same physical markers. All were recorded in the private family ledger with their mother's names, but no father listed. Helena's plan required the children to be raised together, educated together, prepared together. She converted the entire 3rd floor of the main house into nursery and school rooms. She hired a tutor from Pennsylvania, a man named Albert Grayson, who had no connections to Virginia society and asked no questions about the unusual family arrangement. She paid him 3 times the normal rate and required him to live on the estate. The official story, spread carefully through carefully selected social contacts, was that the daughters had each married briefly, men who had died in a yellow fever outbreak that swept through Richmond in 1848 and 1849. The story was plausible enough. Such outbreaks did occur, and the deaths of young men from disease was tragically common. Helena even commissioned mourning jewelry for her daughters, lockets containing locks of hair from men who never existed. Isaac remained in his cabin near the forge. According to the estate's records, he continued his blacksmith work without interruption, but witnesses later recalled seeing him at unusual hours near the main house, seeing him speaking with Helena in the gardens, seeing him watching from a distance when the boys played in the yard. The promised manumission documents were prepared by a lawyer in Richmond, who Helena paid handsomely for discretion. The papers specified that Isaac would be freed on the 18th birthday of the youngest child, along with a deed to 40 acres on the eastern edge of the plantation. The children were to be freed at birth and recognized as heirs to portions of the estate with careful legal language that established them as wards of Helena Ravenswood, orphaned relatives whose parents had died and left them in her care. It was an elaborate legal fiction constructed with surprising sophistication, but it depended entirely on absolute secrecy. That secrecy began to crack in the summer of 1850. A neighboring plantation owner, Richard Yancey, made a social call that Helena couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. He arrived with his wife and daughters, expecting the normal rituals of visiting between plantation families. During the visit, his youngest daughter wandered into the 3rd floor nursery and saw the 6 boys being taught their letters by Mr. Grayson. She was struck by how much they resembled each other despite supposedly having different fathers. She mentioned this observation to her mother, who mentioned it to Richard, who found it curious enough to comment on it to other planters at a tobacco auction in Richmond. The whispers started quietly. Questions about the Ravenswood daughters' mysterious marriages. Questions about the remarkable similarity between the supposedly unrelated boys. Questions about why Helena kept such an isolated household, rarely accepting visitors and declining all invitations to social gatherings. Helena responded by becoming even more reclusive, which only intensified speculation. She stopped attending church, sending the daughters and boys without her. She dismissed several household staff members who she suspected of gossip, replacing them with people who had nowhere else to go and therefore had stronger incentives for loyalty. In the fall of 1851, 2 events occurred that threatened to expose everything. First, one of the dismissed staff members, a woman named Pearl, who had worked in the main house, began telling a different story about the children's origins. She told it to her sister, who told it to her employer, who told it to her husband, who mentioned it to Richard Yancey. The story Pearl told was that all 6 boys had the same father, and that father was an enslaved man on the Ravenswood estate. She didn't know which man, and she had no proof, but she was certain of what she'd observed during her years in the household. Second, Isaac approached Helena with a request that she hadn't anticipated. He wanted to see his sons more often. He wanted them to know who he was. The cottage had served its purpose. The births were complete, and he had fulfilled his part of their arrangement. But watching his children from a distance, while they called him sir or didn't acknowledge him at all, was becoming unbearable. Helena's response to both situations revealed the ruthlessness that had driven the entire plan. Helena understood that managing information required controlling the people who possessed it. She sent 2 men, the plantation's overseer, who had recently returned from North Carolina, and a hired investigator from Richmond to speak with Pearl. They found her working for a family 15 miles away. The conversation was brief. They informed her that spreading false and scandalous rumors about a respectable family could result in legal action for slander. They reminded her that as a free black woman in Virginia, her testimony would not be credited over that of white witnesses, and that associating herself with such stories could result in her being labeled a troublemaker, which could have severe consequences for her ability to find work or maintain her freedom. They suggested she consider the well-being of her sister and her sister's children. Pearl stopped talking about the Ravenswood household. Isaac's request presented a more complex problem. Helena met with him again in Edmund's study, the same room where they had first discussed the arrangement. She reminded him of the agreement, freedom for himself and his children, but only if the secret remained intact. She explained that allowing the children to know their true parentage would inevitably lead to exposure, which would destroy the children's futures as surely as it would destroy the daughters' reputations. The children would lose their legal status as free individuals and could be re-enslaved under Virginia law if the circumstances of their birth were exposed. Isaac argued that the children deserved to know the truth. Helena countered that the truth would destroy them. She offered a compromise. Isaac could work more frequently near the main house, could be present during some of the children's outdoor activities, could become a familiar figure in their lives, even if they didn't know his true relationship to them. She also reminded him with cold clarity that she still held the power to void the manumission agreement if he violated the terms of their arrangement. It was a threat wrapped in a practical discussion. Isaac had no legal recourse. The agreement existed, but its enforcement depended entirely on Helena's willingness to honor it. If he pushed too hard, if he exposed the truth, he would lose everything. His future freedom, his children's futures, potentially his life. He accepted Helena's compromise, but the acceptance came at a cost that manifested in other ways. The overseer's reports from that period note that Isaac became withdrawn, working mechanically, but without his previous focus. He stopped the small social interactions he'd previously maintained with other enslaved people on the plantation. He spent evenings alone in his cabin and on several occasions was observed sitting outside late at night staring toward the main house. Meanwhile, the boys were growing. By 1852, the oldest was 4 years old, the youngest 3. They played together, studied together under Mr. Grayson's instruction, and developed the bonds of brotherhood. Mr. Grayson's letters to a colleague in Pennsylvania discovered decades later describe them as remarkably bright and curiously similar in temperament, quiet, thoughtful, with unusual focus for their ages. Helena had achieved what she set out to create: 6 healthy, intelligent boys who would grow into men capable of managing the plantation. She had navigated the legal complications, maintained the necessary secrecy, and secured her family's future. But she hadn't accounted for human nature, the ways that secrets create pressure, how complicity breeds resentment, how lies require ever more lies to sustain them. The daughters lived in the main house with their children, but the strain of the situation manifested differently in each one. Virginia threw herself into managing household affairs with obsessive attention to detail. Caroline became deeply religious, attending church 3 times weekly and organizing prayer meetings. Elizabeth withdrew into reading, spending hours in the library that Edmund had assembled. Margaret developed headaches that confined her to bed for days at a time. Catherine took long rides across the property, often alone, returning after dark. Sarah, the youngest, seemed to age beyond her years, her face settling into permanent worry lines despite being barely 21. They rarely spoke among themselves about what they had done. The silence became its own form of prison. Dr. Hartwick continued his regular visits, but his journal entries from this period suggest growing discomfort. In one entry from 1853, he wrote, "The Ravenswood situation troubles me deeply. I have facilitated something that defies both moral law and natural order, yet I find myself bound to secrecy by professional obligation and personal complicity. The children are healthy and well cared for, but at what cost to all involved? I question whether I will face divine judgment for my role in this deception." The tension building within the household was matched by increasing external pressure. The rumors that Pearl had briefly spread before being silenced continued to circulate in modified forms. Some said the Ravenswood daughters had all married the same man at different times. Others suggested they had been involved with a married man who died. A few whispered about something more scandalous, but couldn't quite articulate what. Richard Yancey, the neighboring plantation owner, became increasingly curious. He made additional visits, always cordial, always seemingly innocuous, but his questions grew more pointed. He asked about the boys' fathers, expressing sympathy for the tragic losses. He commented on the boys' unusual similarity. He mentioned almost casually that he'd heard interesting stories about the household's arrangements. Helena understood that Yancey was probing, testing to see if his suspicions had substance. She deflected with practiced skill, but each deflection required more elaborate supporting details. She commissioned a marble monument in the Richmond cemetery inscribed with the names of the fictional husbands who had supposedly died in the yellow fever outbreak. She created detailed backstories for each man, complete with fabricated family histories and business connections. The web of lies grew more intricate, more fragile. In the spring of 1854, Isaac made a second request to Helena. He wanted the promise of freedom moved up. He wanted to leave the plantation before the boys turned 18, before he spent another 14 years watching his children grow up without acknowledging him. He had fulfilled his part of the agreement. He wanted his payment now. Helena refused. The agreement specified 18 years, and she would not modify it. Isaac's presence on the plantation served a purpose. He could continue his blacksmith work, continue his carefully controlled, distant relationship with the children, and most importantly, his continued enslavement ensured his silence. A free Isaac could leave Virginia, could potentially speak about what had occurred without fear of legal repercussion against himself. This second refusal created a break in Isaac that had been developing for years. The thing about leverage is that it works both ways. Helena held power over Isaac, but Isaac held the truth that could destroy Helena's entire plan. And desperate people make dangerous calculations. In the summer of 1854, Isaac began keeping a journal. He hid it in a hollow space beneath the floorboards of his cabin, writing by candlelight after his work was done. The journal, discovered in 1889 during the cabin's demolition, contains entries that reveal his mental state during this period. July 14, 1854. I watched William today, Virginia's son, 6 years old, learning to ride. He has my mother's way of sitting a horse, straight-backed and fearless. He will never know this. I am the blacksmith who shoes his pony. Nothing more. The weight of this silence is breaking something inside me. August 3, 1854. Helena Ravenswood believes she has purchased my silence permanently. She believes the promise of future freedom is sufficient to ensure my cooperation until I am old and broken. She does not understand that a man can reach a point where the future matters less than the truth. September 22, 1854. I have made a decision. I do not yet know what form it will take, but I cannot continue this way. The boys deserve to know. I deserve to be known. The journal entries grew more agitated through the fall. Isaac began documenting details of the arrangement, dates, specifics of conversations with Helena, descriptions of the cottage where each daughter had lived, observations about the boy's physical similarities to himself. He was creating evidence, though it's unclear what he intended to do with it. Meanwhile, the boys themselves were developing in ways that made the secret harder to maintain. By age 6 and 7, they were asking questions about their fathers. The older ones remembered inconsistencies in the stories they'd been told. Virginia's son, Edmund, asked why he had never seen a portrait of his father, why his mother never visited a grave, why the name on the cemetery monument didn't match the surname he'd been told. The daughters handled these questions with varying degrees of skill. Some offered elaborate details that contradicted each other, others changed the subject. Sarah, the youngest mother, reportedly told her son the truth in a moment of breakdown, that his father was alive, that he lived on the plantation, that circumstances made acknowledgement impossible. She immediately regretted this confession and made her son swear never to repeat it, but the secret was fragmenting. Richard Yancey intensified his attention to the Ravenswood estate. He began documenting his observations in letters to a cousin in Richmond who worked in the state attorney general's office. These letters, preserved in state archives, reveal Yancey's suspicions. November 1854. The situation at Ravenswood grows more peculiar upon each examination. The 6 boys, all supposedly orphaned sons of different fathers, share remarkable physical similarities: height, eye color, even the way they move. The daughters maintain their stories of brief marriages and tragic deaths, but the details shift with each telling. I have made discreet inquiries in Richmond about the supposed yellow fever outbreak of 1848-1849. Such an outbreak did occur, but none of the names Helena Ravenswood claims as her sons-in-law appear in any death records, newspaper obituaries, or church burial registers. I am beginning to believe that these men never existed. Yancey's investigation represented a significant threat. Unlike Pearl or other dismissed staff, he was a respected plantation owner with social standing and connections. His questions couldn't be silenced with threats or money. If he pursued his suspicions through legal channels, the entire structure of lies would collapse. Helena learned of Yancey's letters through the estate's lawyer in Richmond, who had connections in the Attorney General's office. She understood she was running out of time to manage the situation through carefully controlled information. She needed a more permanent solution. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Ravenswood estate intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What Helena did in response to Yancey's investigation revealed the lengths she would go to protect her secret. She invited him to the estate for a formal dinner, an invitation that Yancey accepted, likely hoping to gather more information. The dinner occurred in December 1854, attended by Yancey and his wife, Helena, and her daughters, and Dr. Hartwick. During the dinner, Helena made Yancey an offer. She acknowledged in carefully worded language that the situation at Ravenswood was complex and unconventional. She suggested that Yancey's continued investigation could expose matters that would harm not only her family, but also damage the reputation of Virginia society more broadly. She offered him a substantial sum of money, the equivalent of 3 years of his plantation's profits, in exchange for his silence and the cessation of his inquiries. Yancey refused. He stated that some matters transcended monetary consideration, that the law existed for a purpose, and that he could not in good conscience ignore what appeared to be serious violations of both legal and moral standards. Helena's response was chilling in its calculated precision. She reminded Yancey that his own plantation, like most in Virginia, operated through the enslavement of human beings. She suggested that anyone who chose to examine the Ravenswood situation too closely might find their own circumstances receiving similar scrutiny. Questions about treatment of enslaved people, about financial dealings, about personal conduct. She implied without stating directly that she possessed information about Yancey's own affairs that he would prefer remained private. It was blackmail delivered in the refined language of plantation society dinner conversation. Yancey, clears throat, left the dinner visibly shaken. His letters to his cousin stopped. His visits to Ravenswood ceased. Whatever Helena had threatened him with was sufficient to end his investigation, but the incident had consequences that Helena couldn't fully control. Dr. Hartwick, who witnessed the dinner conversation, became deeply troubled by Helena's methods. His journal entry from that night reads, December 15, 1854. I have become complicit in something monstrous. It began as a medical matter assisting with births, ensuring healthy children, but I have watched it evolve into a web of lies, threats, and moral corruption. Helena Ravenswood is willing to destroy anyone who threatens her secret, and who threatens her. I am implicated in this destruction. I can no longer claim the excuse of professional obligation. I am an active participant in deception, and now it seems in extortion. I do not know how to extricate myself without causing harm to the innocent children at the center of this situation. Hartwick began drinking heavily after that dinner. According to accounts from his household staff, his medical practice declined as he became unreliable, missing appointments and showing up to emergencies intoxicated. By 1855, his reputation was severely damaged. Isaac, who had no knowledge of the dinner or Yancey's investigation, was reaching his own breaking point through a different path. In the spring of 1855, he approached Virginia directly, asking to speak with her privately. The conversation occurred in the garden away from the main house. No written record of it exists, but Virginia's behavior changed dramatically afterward. She began spending time with Isaac, ostensibly discussing repairs needed for various buildings, but actually having longer conversations about Edmund, their son. She showed Isaac a miniature portrait she'd commissioned of the boy. She told Isaac details about Edmund's personality, his interests, his questions about his father. These conversations were noticed by the other daughters and by Helena. They represented a dangerous breach of the carefully maintained boundaries. Helena confronted Virginia in the library, a confrontation that Elizabeth later described in a letter to her friend. The letter was discovered in 1912. Helena demanded that Virginia cease all unnecessary contact with Isaac, reminding her that such contact threatened everything they had built. Virginia reportedly responded that she was tired of lying, tired of watching her son grow up believing his father was dead when he was actually shoeing horses 50 yards from the main house. The argument escalated. Helena threatened to revoke Virginia's access to her son, to take Edmund and raise him herself if Virginia couldn't maintain the necessary discretion. Virginia threatened to leave the plantation to take Edmund and relocate to another state where they could start fresh away from the web of lies. The confrontation ended with Virginia agreeing to maintain distance from Isaac, but the damage was done. The unified front among the daughters was cracking. If Virginia broke, if she told the truth or fled with her son, the entire structure would collapse. Helena understood she needed to resolve the situation before it deteriorated further. She made a decision that would prove catastrophic. In the summer of 1855, Helena summoned Isaac to the main house one final time. She told him she was prepared to honor the manumission agreement early, but with modified terms. He would be freed immediately and given not 40 acres but 60, along with enough money to establish himself as an independent blacksmith in another state, preferably as far from Virginia as possible. In exchange, he would leave within a week and never return, never contact any of the boys, and never speak of what had occurred at Ravenswood. It was a better offer than the original agreement in material terms, but it required Isaac to abandon his children completely to become permanently erased from their lives. Isaac refused. He stated that he would accept freedom, he would accept land, but he would not leave Virginia while his sons were still children. He wanted to remain at least in the same state, to maintain some distant presence in their lives, even if they never knew the truth. Helena told him that was unacceptable. His continued presence in Virginia presented an ongoing risk. She needed him gone permanently and completely. The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental imbalance of power that had existed throughout their entire arrangement. Helena still owned Isaac under law. The manumission agreement existed, but it wasn't yet executed. She held all the legal authority. Isaac held only the truth, and the truth was a weapon that would destroy his children as surely as it would destroy Helena's family. Helena made her final offer: immediate freedom and passage to California, where gold rush opportunities could set him up for life, along with $500 and a letter of introduction to business contacts in San Francisco. In exchange for permanent departure and absolute silence, she would ensure his sons received excellent educations and substantial inheritances. They would live well, even if they never knew their father. Isaac asked for time to consider. Helena gave him 24 hours. During those 24 hours, Isaac wrote a final journal entry retrieved from the hollow beneath his cabin floor. July 20th, 1855. I am faced with an impossible choice. I can accept freedom but abandon my children, or I can refuse and remain enslaved, with no guarantee that Helena will honor any agreement. If I expose the truth, my sons lose their legal status as free individuals. They could be re-enslaved. Their futures would be destroyed. But if I leave, I become a ghost. They will grow up believing a lie. They will never know their history, their bloodline, their father. What kind of legacy is that? What kind of man abandons his children for his own freedom? The entry ends there, unfinished. What Isaac did in those final hours before his decision became a matter of disputed accounts and conflicting evidence. Delia, Helena's personal maid, who had served as intermediary during the cottage period, later told her daughter that she saw Isaac near the main house very late that night, standing beneath the third-floor windows where the boys slept. She said he remained there for nearly an hour, completely still, just watching the darkened windows. When she approached him to ask what he was doing, he told her he was memorizing something he would never see again. Another account from the night watchman who patrolled the property claimed he saw Isaac walking toward the main house carrying something wrapped in cloth. But when the watchman called out, Isaac changed direction and returned to his cabin. The watchman noted this in his log but thought nothing of it at the time. Enslaved people moving about at night was not unusual, and Isaac had certain privileges that others did not. Virginia later told Elizabeth in a conversation Elizabeth recorded in her diary that she heard someone outside her window that night. She looked out and saw a figure in the darkness, but when she called out, whoever it was disappeared into the shadows. She convinced herself it had been her imagination, a product of the stress and guilt that had been consuming her for months. Only later did she wonder if it had been Isaac, trying one final time to be close to his son. The next morning, Isaac's cabin was found empty. His forged tools remained. His few personal possessions were still in the cabin, but Isaac himself had vanished. The overseer's report stated that Isaac had run away during the night, a common enough occurrence with enslaved people. A perfunctory search was conducted. Advertisements for his return were posted in Richmond newspapers, required by law, but written in such vague terms that they would be unlikely to result in his recovery. After 2 weeks, the search was officially abandoned. Helena told the household that Isaac had evidently chosen to run north, seeking freedom on his own terms. She expressed disappointment that such a valuable worker had fled, but she made no unusual effort to recover him. But there were details that troubled those who knew the situation intimately. The overseer privately questioned why a man planning to run away would leave behind the excellent boots he owned, custom-made to fit his unusual foot size. Why would he leave the small amount of money he had saved over years, coins hidden in a tin box under his bed? Why would he abandon the journal he had been keeping so carefully, a record that could have served as leverage if he chose to expose the truth from a position of safety in the north? The daughters understood that something had happened, but the details remained unclear. Virginia confronted Helena directly, demanding to know what had occurred. Helena maintained that Isaac had simply run away, that she had offered him an opportunity, and he had rejected it, choosing to flee instead. But several details didn't align with that story. Running away typically involved taking supplies, tools, anything of value that could be sold or traded. Isaac's belongings remained untouched. People who ran away typically headed north toward free states, but no reports of anyone matching Isaac's distinctive appearance surfaced from the network of people who tracked runaway enslaved people. A man 6 feet 4 inches tall with amber eyes would have been noticed, remembered, reported. Virginia pressed harder, suggesting that Helena had done something to ensure Isaac's permanent silence. Helena's response was cold and unambiguous. Isaac Drummond made his choice. Whatever became of him afterward is a consequence of that choice. You would do well to concern yourself with your son's future, rather than with matters that cannot be changed. The implication was clear, even if Helena never stated it directly. Virginia understood that pursuing the question further would yield no answers and might endanger her own position. She dropped the matter, but the suspicion remained, festering like an untreated wound. The boys asked about Isaac's disappearance. They had grown accustomed to seeing him around the estate, and his sudden absence was noted. They were told he had run away, seeking freedom. The older boys understood what this meant. The younger ones simply knew that the blacksmith was gone. Edmund, Virginia's eldest son at 7 years old, seemed particularly affected by Isaac's disappearance. He had spent more time around the forge than his cousins, fascinated by the work of shaping metal by the precision and strength it required. He asked his mother repeatedly what had happened to the blacksmith, why he had left, whether he would return. Virginia's answers grew shorter and more evasive with each asking, until finally she told Edmund never to mention Isaac's name again. 3 months after Isaac's disappearance in October 1855, Dr. Hartwick died. The official cause listed in death records was liver failure, likely related to his heavy drinking. But Hartwick's final journal entry, written the day before his death, suggests something more complex. October 3, 1855. I can no longer carry this burden. Isaac Drummond did not run away. I know this with certainty, though I cannot prove it. I believe Helena arranged his permanent removal from the situation. I have no evidence beyond his uncharacteristic failure to take anything with him, beyond Helena's peculiar lack of effort to recover such a valuable piece of property, beyond the timing. Immediately after she made him an offer, he refused. I'm complicit in so much already. I cannot add murder to my list of sins, but I cannot expose it either without implicating myself in the entire sordid arrangement. I have failed every oath I took as a physician. I no longer wish to live with this knowledge. Hartwick's death was ruled natural causes. His private journals were collected by his widow and stored in a trunk, eventually making their way to a historical society where they remained unexamined for decades. The overseer who had been present during the search for Isaac, a man named Thomas Garrett, left the Ravenswood estates' employment in December 1855. He moved to North Carolina and never returned to Virginia. Years later, in a letter to a former colleague written in 1871, he made a cryptic reference to events at Ravenswood. There are things I witnessed in Virginia that I pray never to see again. Some secrets are buried too deep to ever be safely unearthed, and some women are more ruthless than any man I ever knew. I left because I valued my soul more than my salary. With both Isaac and Hartwick gone, the two people who possessed full knowledge of Helena's plan and the ability to expose it were removed from the equation. The daughters remained, but they were implicated in the scheme. Exposure would destroy them as surely as it would destroy Helena. The secret was secure again, locked behind walls of complicity and fear. The boys continued growing, continued their education, continued preparing for their role as heirs to the plantation, never knowing the truth of their origins. But something had changed in the household after Isaac's disappearance. The daughters became more withdrawn from each other. each retreating into private grief or guilt that they couldn't share. The unity that Helena had maintained through force of will began to fracture in subtle ways. The years that followed seemed to validate Helena's plan, at least on the surface. The boys grew into intelligent, capable young men. They received educations that far exceeded what was typical for Virginia plantations, studying not just basic reading and mathematics, but literature, history, philosophy, and practical sciences. Mr. Grayson, the tutor, remained with them until 1862, when the Civil War made his position untenable. The war itself disrupted everything Helena had constructed. When Virginia seceded in 1861, the plantation's operations became subject to Confederate requisitions, labor shortages, and general chaos. The boys were teenagers by then, ranging from 13 to 16 years old. They watched as the world they had been prepared to inherit crumbled around them. Helena died in 1863 during the war from pneumonia. She was 62 years old. Her final instructions to her daughters delivered from her deathbed were reportedly simple. Maintain the story, protect the boys, never tell the truth. The daughters honored this instruction, but the truth became increasingly difficult to suppress as the boys matured and began asking more pointed questions about their origins. The end of the war and the abolition of slavery made the entire social structure they had been raised in collapse. The plantation never recovered its antebellum prosperity. By 1870, it had been subdivided and sold to pay debts. During the final sale of the property, workers clearing out the old slave quarters discovered something disturbing in a wooded area approximately 300 yards from Isaac's former cabin. They found skeletal remains buried in a shallow grave, along with fragments of clothing and a leather belt with distinctive brass fittings. The overseer who had replaced Garrett examined the remains and noted in his report that the deceased had been a man of unusual height based on the length of the leg bones. The discovery was reported to local authorities, but in the chaos of reconstruction, the investigation was perfunctory. The remains were assumed to be those of an unknown Confederate soldier, or perhaps a runaway who had died of natural causes and been buried by companions. No connection was made to Isaac Drummond, whose disappearance 15 years earlier had been officially recorded as a successful escape. The remains were buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery, and the matter was closed. But Caroline, who still lived in the area at the time, heard about the discovery. She visited the site where the remains had been found and saw the fragments of the leather belt before they were buried. She recognized the brass fittings. She had seen Isaac wearing that belt many times during the years when the cottage was in use, when each daughter had spent her time in that isolated space with him. She said nothing to the authorities, but she wrote a letter to Virginia, who had already moved to Philadelphia with her son. The letter, preserved in Virginia's papers and discovered in 1908, contained only a few sentences. They found him. He never left. Mother lied about everything just as she lied about so much else. What are we supposed to do with this knowledge? We cannot tell the boys. We can never tell the boys. This secret will die with us, as it should have died with her. Virginia's response, if she sent one, has not survived, but her behavior changed after receiving that letter. She became deeply involved in charitable work, particularly organizations that assisted formerly enslaved people in transitioning to freedom. She donated substantial portions of her inheritance to these causes, more than she could reasonably afford. Her son Edmund later wrote that his mother seemed to be atoning for something, though she would never explain what. The boys scattered to different parts of the country. Virginia's son, Edmund, became a teacher in Philadelphia, dedicating his life to educating black children in the years after emancipation. He never married, though he maintained close relationships with his cousins. Caroline's son, James, became a merchant in Baltimore, building a successful business that employed both black and white workers at a time when such integration was rare. Elizabeth's son, Robert, became a physician, studying in Boston and eventually establishing a practice that served the poorest communities in New York City. The other three sons also found paths that seemed driven by something beyond mere ambition. Margaret's son, Henry, became a lawyer who specialized in defending the rights of freed men in legal disputes. Catherine's son, Charles, became a journalist, writing extensively about social justice issues. Sarah's son, William, became a minister, preaching a gospel of redemption and forgiveness that his parishioners found deeply moving. Each of them, in their own way, seemed to be working towards something, perhaps unconsciously attempting to balance an equation they didn't fully understand to make right a wrong they couldn't name. Whether any of them ever learned the full truth of their origins remains unclear. Some evidence suggests that at least Edmund did through anonymous letters he received in the 1890s, but he never acknowledged this publicly. The daughters lived out their lives carrying the secret, dying one by one between 1880 and 1903. Sarah, the youngest, lived to be 73, dying in 1902 in a boarding house in Richmond, supported by a small pension from Edmund, her eldest nephew. According to the proprietor of the boarding house, Sarah spent her final years in a state of mental confusion, often speaking to people who weren't there, asking forgiveness from someone named Isaac, and insisting that her son needed to know the truth. The proprietor assumed these were the delusions of an aging mind and thought nothing of them. Before her death, Sarah made one final attempt to set the record straight. She wrote a letter to William, her son, detailing everything that had happened, the arrangement Helena had made, the cottage where each daughter had lived with Isaac, the births, the promises, Isaac's disappearance, and her belief that Helena had arranged his murder. She sealed the letter and gave it to the boarding house proprietor with instructions to deliver it to William after her death. The proprietor, a religious woman who read the letter before delivering it, was so shocked by its contents that she burned it instead. She later justified this decision by saying that some truths were too terrible to be spoken, that the dead deserved to rest in peace, and that exposing such a scandal would serve no purpose except to cause pain to innocent people. She told William only that his mother had left him a letter expressing her love and asking his forgiveness for unspecified failings as a parent. William accepted this, never knowing how close he had come to learning the truth. The truth about the Ravenswood situation began emerging only after all the principals were dead. The discovery of Dr. Hartwick's journals in 1897 by a researcher investigating medical practices in antebellum Virginia revealed the first documentary evidence. Isaac's journal was found in 1889 during demolition of his cabin. The family's private ledger was discovered in 1923. The skeletal remains found in 1870 were never definitively identified, but circumstantial evidence, the location, the timing, the physical characteristics strongly suggested they were Isaac Drummond's. Historians who examined these documents struggled with what to make of them. The story challenged every conventional narrative about plantation life, about family structure, about the nature of power and coercion. Some questioned the authenticity of the documents. Others argued about how to interpret Helena's actions. Was she a woman using the only means available to her to secure her family's future? Or was she a manipulator who exploited an enslaved man and coerced her own daughters? The academic debate continued for decades. In 1934, a historian named Margaret Thornton published a comprehensive study of the Ravenswood case, drawing on all available documents and attempting to construct a complete narrative. Her work was criticized by some as sensationalist and by others as too sympathetic to Helena's position. The controversy highlighted how difficult it was to judge historical actions through contemporary moral frameworks and how the intersection of slavery, gender, and power created situations that defied simple categorization. The boys themselves never publicly acknowledged the truth. If they learned of it later in life, and some evidence suggests that at least Edmund did through letters he received from an anonymous source in the 1890s, they chose to maintain silence. They had built lives, families, and reputations under the names and stories they had been given. Exposing the truth would have served no purpose except to destroy what they had built. One curious detail emerged in genealogical research conducted in the 1950s. All 6 of Isaac's sons had numerous descendants, and researchers noted that the distinctive amber eyes and crescent-shaped birth arc appeared in many of them, spanning multiple generations. These genetic markers became a kind of living testimony to Isaac's existence, physical evidence that persisted long after all documentary evidence had been debated and disputed. Isaac Drummond's ultimate fate, despite the discovery of remains that likely were his, remained officially uncertain in historical records. The connection between those remains and Isaac was never proven definitively, maintained as strong suspicion rather than confirmed fact. No death certificate was ever issued. No burial record listed his name. He remained, in official terms, a runaway whose fate was unknown, a ghost in the historical record present only through inference and implication. The only traces of his verified existence were the 6 sons who carried his genetic legacy, the journal hidden beneath cabin floorboards, the disturbing documents that eventually made their way into archives, and the profound impact his descendants had on the communities where they lived and worked. The boys he never got to claim as his own became men of remarkable character, each contributing something significant to the society that had tried to deny their father's humanity. The Ravenswood estate itself declined into ruin after being subdivided. The main house stood empty for years before being demolished in 1934. The land was eventually absorbed into larger agricultural operations, losing its distinct identity. By the mid-10th century, most people in the area had forgotten the Ravenswood name entirely. The story survived only in fragmentary documents: Hartwick's journals, Isaac's writings, the private family ledger, letters from Virginia and her sisters, Yancey's correspondence, overseer reports, and the mysterious skeletal remains that were never definitively identified. Each document offered a piece of the truth, but none provided complete answers. Historians assembled these fragments into a narrative, but significant gaps remained. What role, if any, did Helena play in Isaac's death? The evidence suggests her involvement, but proves nothing definitively. Did Isaac actually refuse her final offer, or did something else occur during those final 24 hours? Why did Doctor die so suddenly after writing his final journal entry? Was it truly liver failure, or did his knowledge make him a liability? How much did the boys eventually learn? And what did they choose to do with that knowledge? The documents raise these questions but provide no definitive answers, leaving the full truth of the Ravenswood situation suspended between what can be proven and what can only be suspected. The skeletal remains found in 1870 add one more piece to the puzzle but also raise new questions. If those were Isaac's remains, who buried him there? Who knew about the burial? And why did no one come forward with information at the time? What remains clear is that Helena Ravenswood conceived and executed a plan that violated every social boundary of her era, used her power over an enslaved man to achieve her goals, manipulated her own daughters into compliance, and managed to keep the truth hidden through a combination of legal maneuvering, social pressure, and possible violence. She created 6 children who lived their entire lives under false identities, never fully knowing their history or their father. And she did all of it in service of maintaining a plantation and a legacy that would ultimately crumble anyway, destroyed by forces far larger than her careful plans. The Ravenswood case stands as a disturbing example of how power operates, how secrets metastasize, and how the consequences of antebellum slavery extended far beyond the legal relationships between enslaver and enslaved. It shows how women, even those with significant property and social standing, operated within constraints that drove them to desperate measures. It reveals how coercion can wear many faces, from outright violence to the manipulation of hope and desire for family and freedom. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is how the children, Isaac's 6 sons, became instruments of their own father's eraser, living embodiment of a crime they knew nothing about. Their very existence both testament to and concealment of the truth. They carried Isaac's blood, his genetic legacy, his physical characteristics, but were denied his name, his history, his story. In this way, the violence done to Isaac continued across generations, a wound that never fully healed, because it was never acknowledged. This mystery shows us that the darkest chapters of history often remain hidden, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because everyone involved has reasons to maintain silence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.